Well, hello, everybody. Happy Friday. I'm Erica Lukes, and this is Expanding Frontiers. You can go to expandingfrontiersresearch.org to check out our work. We are always coming up with new things to FOIA. We're getting new information every day, negotiating with the State Records Committee to get stories broken and information put forward to you about what's taking place here in Utah and across the country. I love partnering with Jack Brewer. He is an exceptional addition and the backbone of EFR. So I want to thank him. He is in chat, so you can definitely chat with him. I also want to just take a second to thank everybody. Jim, you are up late. I love that. And Tom, nice to see you. I know that we'll be joined by a few of our regular listeners. And I want to thank you for your support. I've done this show for almost probably 10 years now. And it's been fun to get to know you and to learn a lot about not only the world of UFOs, the world of the intelligence agencies, the world of disinformation, book bans, all sorts of things, environmental issues. And it's been a fun thing to kind of uncover different things and then to bring on guests that really add to what we do at Expanding Frontiers Research. And our guest this evening is one of those people. He was on the show, I think it's been maybe, I don't know, Chris, how was it, a year ago?
It was a year or two, something like that.
Wow, time flies when you're stuck in a little, I don't know what. I think COVID slowed things down.
Yeah.
In my brain. And so I'm really happy to have you back because I've got so many questions for you. And I want to introduce you because you're a very interesting human being. And not only are you an artist, which we talked about on our last show, and I'm assuming that is one of your pieces behind you, right?
Yeah, that's camel crickets.
That is so cool. I love it. But you are also the curator of the Poe Museum in Virginia, and you have curated critically acclaimed exhibitions for the gallery and galleries across the country, including the Library of Virginia exhibit Poe, Man, Myth, or Monster. And I'm sure that it was absolutely incredible. You have a cemetery. Oh my goodness, that's where my mind goes. You have a website. It's been a long day. You have a website, chrissemtner.com, where you can go to look at all of your work, your art, your written work, to learn more about everything that you are and everything that you add to the world. And I love watching, I've been geeking out on your Instagram videos. And I love how you you have these fun conversations. You're talking about Edgar Allan Poe. Well, I think they're very fun.
Oh. Oh, thanks.
Very intriguing, and you're just a really cool guy, and I'm happy to talk with you. So I want to ask you, first of all, what have you been doing? I know obviously your plate's very full with everything, but what's been going on in your world?
Well, we're preparing for a redesign at the museum. So basically, we want to reinstall the exhibits. There's a lot more stuff that we've gotten just in the past few years, and more stuff keeps coming. So we want to be able to show it off. And we just got this super cool. It's a letter from Poe to Washington Irving. So perfect for Halloween time. It's, a letter from the Raven to the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, these titans of American literature. And we've got this document that we just got it back in July. And now we can announce it's been a session. It's on the website now. But I think the cats are messing with my painting.
It looks so cool.
It's running around the room. Lily and Macy. So they're new too. They just sort of showed up. Whenever there's a vacancy, the Feline Distribution Center lets them know. They dispatch one and they just sort of show up at your front door. Or Macy, in her case, she showed up in a storm drain. We were going to call her Stormy because she was in a storm drain, but it was outside the Macy's parking lot. So we figured Macy is kind of a nicer name. So she and Lily are chasing each other around the room and all sorts of mayhem's ensuing. But in addition to that, I just had a show open up of my paintings over at Visual Art Studio here in Richmond and working on a couple different books. There's one that's about Poe's homes, a place he lived. And it's sort of, instead of just a standard biography, I want to really talk about the different houses where he lived, the presence he left on each of the houses, the stories each of those houses have to tell us about. And then there's another one that's coming out probably next year. It's about the women behind Poe's poems. And very often he was clear about who he wrote the poem about. So we're getting into the symbolism of what that poem means and what it meant in the context of when he gave it to them. But also, I want to find out, who were these people as human beings? What did they accomplish? And you find in the case of somebody like Sarah Helen Whitman, she was an accomplished poet back before Poe was even a name. She was connected with transcendentalism and spiritualism, abolitionism. She was part of all these different movements all at the same time. She was tapped into everything, and she has a story to tell. But then there's also Poe's nurse. He wrote The Beloved Physician for her, and thought she was, this kind soul who'd helped him through his hardest times. And then later she was accused of poisoning her daughter-in-law.
Oh my goodness.
The murderer, or is she the kind beloved physician? We'll never quite know. She was acquitted, but a lot of people thought that she probably did it. So I want to get to these stories of who these people were, because they're fascinating people. They're very often overlooked. You might just say, oh yeah, that's the one he dedicated to Helen to, but really, what was her life? She existed before Poe came along. Some of these people actually survived having known Poe, and they existed for decades later. But what were their stories? So that's something I've worked on, and that should be coming out next year. And then writing chapters for other things. And the museum's always busy. Last year we had every single 8th grade student in the city of Richmond come to the Poe Museum in October, and we hope to do that with all the surrounding counties. And whenever possible, if people can't come to Virginia, we're doing virtual programs where we can reach out to them, and sometimes even traveling to different places to go give talks.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wow, your plate is full. I've got to ask you, what is it like to see 8th graders come through the museum? Because that's such an interesting age. And there's 8th graders are so inquisitive, but I bet they have a lot of really funny and quite intelligent things to say when they
Oh yeah,
see.
they're good jumpers. Like when they come into the garden and one of the cats will see them, the cat will run up to them and then jump over the hedge, and all of a sudden the kids scream and they've just read The Black Cat. Or I'd like to do a performance of The Telltale Heart for them, and you can spot the kids who, they're looking down at their phone or they're a little bit bored. And if you get them just right, you can get a good jump scare out of them, because The Telltale Heart's got some good jump scares you wouldn't expect. There are moments where it gets really quiet and all of a sudden, bang, and really gets them involved with literature. But the best thing about it is seeing them when they leave and they buy a book of Poe's works, because they could be spending their money on anything, because who reads anymore? There's TikTok. You don't need to read anymore.
Right.
But then they leave carrying one of Poe's books. And even if it's just 1% of those students, at least that's 1% you've reached. And who knows what's going to happen next? They could go on to become writers. They could not become writers. They could become filmmakers or engineers or scientists. Who knows where they're going to lead? But you got this little spark of their imagination. You just give them a little spark. So maybe it'll set a fire. We don't really like fire metaphors in the museum, a lot of paper there. But anyway, point.
No, but it is so fun to inspire that young mind. Like you said, you don't know what they're going to grow up to be, but everybody in their own way leaves a mark. And how many of us remember reading Edgar Allan Poe when we were in grade school? And that is pretty heavy stuff, that it sparks your imagination, and it takes you to dark places, and it makes you reflect, and it really is, it's incredible. I think all of us have. I was talking to my clients this week and just asking, let's talk about Edgar Allan Poe. And, every single one of them had a story about what they read as a child, what they read as an adult of his. And I just think that is really, really cool that you have the ability to do that and to foster the imagination of so many children at that age.
It's so cool that you remember what you read as a kid. There's a lot of stuff you have to read in school that you're forced to read, but there's some things that really made an impression. They stick with you for years later. I can still remember the way the book might have felt, the way it smelled, the way the cover looked. But also you remember the stories inside that book. And it's great that from an early age you can make that connection and can stick with you. And I always tell you that story about the telltale heart right when I was a kid, and then years later it stuck with me. It's so succinct, it just gets right to the point. But there's something also, it's almost like a fairy tale, that there's an unreality to the story.
Okay, I know that there are actually people that have not read that. So for those people, will you just give us a rundown of Telltale Heart?
Okay, imagine you're in a dark room. You've laid down to bed at night, and there's some slight noise that wakes you up. You can't see anything, but you hear something. You feel that there's something there, even though it's pitch black. And that's basically what this story's about. Most of it's set in total darkness. There's a man, our narrator, who loves the old man. He takes care of him, says he's never wronged me, never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. But there's something about that old man's eye. It's all pale and blue with a film over it. He says it makes his blood run cold when he sees it, and chills his bones, the very marrow, just looking upon that eye. So I made up his mind by degrees to take the life of the old man, thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad, but mad men know nothing. You should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than I was for the whole week before I killed him. And every night he just creeps to his chamber door and turns a latch, and he opens that door just enough to put his head within the room. And every night he looks in, he shines a little lantern on that eye, but every night the eye's closed. And then after 7 long nights of this, finally, the old man wakes up. He hears the murder at the door, and he wakes up. And this is a cool part. For a full hour, he just sits there, waiting in the darkness, letting his imagination run wild. The story doesn't take an hour to read. He just says that, he wouldn't lie back down, because although he could not see my face in the room, he could sense its presence. Death's long shadow enveloped the victim. And, the old man, he's trying to convince us, oh, it's just the wind in the chimney, just a cricket that made a single chirp. But to no avail, to no avail. And it's great how you're building up this tension gradually. And the murderer, he's so sensitive to every sound that even though you can't see anything in the room, it's a dark room, he can hear the death watches in the walls, those little click beetles. He can hear them clicking, click, 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 click. And he can hear the guy breathe across the room, and he can hear rolling in bed. He can hear a moan across the room. But then he hears, tick, 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 and he says, that's the old man's heart. I can hear his heart beating from across the room. And finally, he shines his lantern on the old man's eye, and this time it's open wide open. So he has to kill him. So he jumps in there with a loud shriek, and he smothers him under his own mattress, and then he chops up the body, hides it there under the floorboards. And the police come. Some neighbor heard her scream the nights, and suspecting foul play, dispatched them. And he says, "Oh, search well. This scream is my own in a dream. The old man, he's absent in the country." And the murderer convinces the police, and they're about to leave, and he says, "Oh, let's have some coffee." So they pulls him up 3 chairs for the police in the old man's chamber where the body reposes. In fact, he puts his own chair on top of where he buried the body. And as he's sitting there, listening to the police speak of trivial things, familiar things, and he starts to hear tick, 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 tick. At first, he thinks it's in his ears, and he speaks louder and louder and in a heightened tone, but he can't cover up the noise. And he realizes the noise isn't within my ears. And he starts to really believe that the noise is coming from underneath the floor where he's hidden the body. And And it doesn't go well for him, but it's a story of all that built up tension. And when you finally get to the end, he finally can release that tension, but it's just a gradual buildup all throughout the story. And it's a short story, about 6 pages long. But he gets rid of all the extraneous details. You don't know what the outside of the building is because you never go outside. Most of the story is set within this room of indeterminate size. It's a bedroom, so we don't know exactly how big it is. He's probably in an apartment building because the neighbors are close enough to hear him through the walls. In fact, the murderer is worried that the neighbors can hear the heart beating through the walls. He's worried the cops can hear the heart beating, but for some reason, the police act like they can't hear it. Is it possible they heard not? Almighty God, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my terror. So that's the Telltale Heart in a nutshell.
Oh, thank you. I love listening to you talk about that, and just the way you express his words. It's really I love it, and thank you. And it makes me excited for Halloween. I just got to say, I know it's not October, but it's close enough that I
Almost.
am so excited for. I love it, love it, love it. So this is my good like warm up for Halloween to hear all of this. And it is amazing how Edgar Allan Poe in 6 pages, as you say, could just take you there. I mean, build that suspense and just keep you on the edge of your seat, and then leave you with that memory for your entire life.
Yeah.
It's just there are few storytellers with that finesse, and that's just amazing. So I want to go back to, because first let me ask a question, because Tom would like me to ask you this, and then I want to go back to what you're working on now with the women that were in Poe's life, which that's a really cool endeavor. But I want to ask this: so, there have been numerous films about Edgar Allan Poe. What actor do you feel did his best job in portraying Poe?
I think maybe Jeffrey Combs. Jeffrey Combs really got into it. He was Dr. Herbert West in Reanimator from 1985 and the Reanimator sequels. But if you really look, Combs turns up in The Frighteners with Michael J. Fox. He turns up on Star Trek The Next Generation. He's really a character actor, so he sort of disappears into these roles. And he did Poe for the Masters of Horror show. It was a show on Showtime, and each episode of this sort of anthology series was directed by a different director. And Stuart Gordon was the one who directed the Black Cat episode, and Stuart Gordon was the director of Reanimator, so they've had a long history. And they told the story in such a way that Poe himself is the husband in the story, and his wife Virginia is the wife in the story. And they were so successful with this characterization that later they developed a solo stage play where Combs would go on stage as Poe. And not only did he do the usual things, he got prosthetics to make his nose look right, and he also tried to adopt sort of a Southern accent to try to sound like he thinks Poe would have sounded. So he seems to have really embodied Poe's character. And more recently, there's Harry Melling, the guy from The Pale Blue Eye, which you can see now on Netflix. And it's a fictional story. It's based on a novel by Louis Bayard. It's about Poe as a student at West Point. And Poe really was a cadet at West Point until he got kicked out for gross neglect of duty. But he imagines there's a murder there, and that the young cadet Poe has to help solve the murder. And Harry Melling, he doesn't look exactly like Poe, but I think he really had these moments where he's portraying a 21-year-old guy, but he gives him that little bit of a quirky sense of humor, a little bit of weirdness to him. So he's not just reading the lines, and he's not just the usual Poe you see in the movies who's just sloshing drunk the entire time. There's still kind of a sharpness to him that sort of transcends the rest of the show. The show is a little bit slow, but I think he helped redeem it. Also, Christian Bale was in it.
That's
You
right.
have Batman and Poe in the same movie.
Dang. That's what I'm
Yeah,
gonna watch tonight. Thank you. And then
yeah,
followed by Frighteners, because
yeah.
I haven't seen
Frighteners
that
was a fun
forever.
one. I want to say Peter Jackson directed that. It's a pretty weird up one where
That's right.
they have a they have these paranormal investigators, supposed exorcists whose friends are with a bunch of ghosts who help them stage hauntings. Well, that's not really staging if they're ghosts, but it's fun with ghosts.
Sounds like just I think I'm gonna have a great night ahead of me, not only talking to you, but watching those 2 movies. So, thank you for answering that. I appreciate that. That's wonderful. And so, do you mind if we go back and talk a little bit about your new what you're writing about and what you're researching? And I want to first ask you, when you're researching things for a book, like what is your first step in the research process?
I want to read what other people have written about it to find out, well, what paths have people already followed, and I try to find a subject that nobody has quite followed that in the same way. And then I want to look at Poe's letters, especially if it's dealing with somebody in his life, to look at the letters. And newspapers are always a good place to go because there's millions of newspapers online now. So you can do keyword searches for newspapers by state or by year. So if you want to look up 1848 or a period from 1840 to 1850 to find every mention of this person, you can sort of trace back what they're doing. And then I look through the museum's archives and what artifacts they have. For instance, that lady I told you about, his beloved physician, it turns out that the Poe Museum has a copy of Poe's poems, the 1850 edition, that she owns that has her writing in it. And when she knew Poe, she was married. She was married to this guy, Joel Shue. Her name's Marie Louise Shue, so he's married to Joel Shue. And when Poe gave her that poem, The Beloved Physician, she burned it because she said it was so personal. She didn't want anybody else to ever read it. She heard Poe was going to sell it to a magazine, so she just bought it from him for more and destroyed it. But he also wrote a couple of Valentine's poems to her. And the last Valentine's poem he wrote to her was just titled To Blank Blank. So he didn't even put her name on it. And when you read it, it's not great. It's blank verse, and he's better when he does these beautiful rhyming poems and the rhythms to it, and it's very musical. But this one's not great. But there's this weird passage in it where he says the pen falls from his trembling hand, and you're like, well, that's kind of weird. Why is the pen falling from his trembling hand? And then you look back at the different versions he published that poem over the years, and the manuscript he gave her and the manuscript that he gave her of that poem had 6 extra lines where he talks about the palpitating tide of passion overcoming him. And that's why he's like dropping his pen, is because he's overcome with passion for her. And there's no way she's going to let him publish that. So he took 6 lines of the poem before he finally published it, but he still kept her name off of it. And that brings us back to this copy of Poe's book. It's from 1850, I mentioned. That's a year after his death, and his literary executor compiled Poe's different poems and stories and essays into different volumes. And by this time, Poe's mother-in-law, she's destitute. She's got no place to go, so she's living with different Poe admirers who'll take care of her. And in October of 1850, she was living with Marie Louise Shue. And that's the date that she wrote on the book for when Mariah Clem, the mother-in-law, gave that to her. So all this stuff is coming together. And also in October 1850, that's the month Marie Louise Shue divorced Joel Shue. So now that she's free of the old ball and chain, in her copy of the book, she wrote over the title where it says To Blank Blank, she wrote To Marie Louise Shue to make sure everybody knew that poem was about her. And now when you see the poem in different anthologies, it's called To Marie Louise. And here she was saying, yep, that's my poem. I don't want anybody mistaking it. That's me now.
How interesting.
And that's something that's, as far as I know, it's never been published. And it just adds a little bit more color to what's going on outside of Poe, beyond what Poe's involved with. I like the poster part of it, but I also really interested in the other part. Like, one of Poe's very close friends was Frances Sargent Osgood. There's been novels written about his relationship with her, about the flirtatious poetry they exchanged. But I want to talk about, what on happened after Poe's death. She actually wrote a beautiful poem, "The Hand That Swept the Sounding Lyre."
Oh,
It's a poem about Poe's memory. And she makes reference to Israfel. That's one of his poems about the angel with the most beautiful voice in all of heaven. And Poe wrote that if Israfel had to suffer like Poe had, that he couldn't have sung as well as Poe could if Poe hadn't had to suffer on earth as he suffered. And people in Poe's time often identified him with Israfel. In fact, there's a biography of Poe that's called Israfel. And after Poe died, she published this poem, and then later, Poe's enemy Rufus Griswold kind of had a crush on her. Even though she was married, he kept like following around. He's like, "Hey, let me take you to the springs. It'll heal your tuberculosis if you go to the springs with me." So they went there, and then he insisted on being her deathbed. He wanted to sit by her deathbed and be a spiritual advisor to her. And her husband was like, "You've got to get out of here. This is too much. You're kind of creepy, guy," because he was really obsessive, refused to leave her side. And after she died, old Poe's enemy and her crush changed the poem. And he took out all the masculine pronouns and changed them to feminine pronouns, took out Israfel and turned it to Israel. And instead of making it about Poe, she made it about Francis's daughter, Fanny Faye,
oh,
and tricked people into thinking that that's what the poem was about. So her husband, reading the new version of the poem, thought, "Oh, it's about Fanny Faye. That's kind of nice. I'm going to put a monument over my wife's grave that looks like a lyre, like a big musical instrument." And he has no idea that that's actually, he just put a reference to her poem about another man on his wife's tombstone.
wow. That's one way to do it.
Yeah.
Oh, God. How and so you're researching, you're using newspaper clips. That is not that's a tedious process, I would imagine.
Yeah, and you also look through a lot of letters and find out what are people saying. And people fortunately have done a lot of research into any letter about Poe and the correspondence of people who knew him. Because by the 1860s, 1870s, people were starting to write biographies of Poe, and they started writing to the people he'd known. So some of those people were Sarah Helen Whitman, his one-time fiance, and Annie Richmond, who he wrote the poem for Annie for her, and even Marie Louise Shoes. So we have access to the letters they wrote back and forth to, say, Poe's English biographer, John Henry Ingram. So there's a great book that has a lot of these letters where it's sort of building up the biography of Poe through the different stories. So it's not as difficult as it would have been 100 years ago to access all these things, because a lot of things you can find online, or there are books in our library, we can read them.
But I mean, how fascinating, though. I mean, it's amazing that those are actually still available
Oh yeah, it's great. It helps
and
fill
preserved.
in all the details. Because fortunately, people for the past century or so have been collecting letters about Poe. So there's a lot of letters in the Poe Museum's collection that are about Poe. Say we've got one that's written by one of his classmates growing up, and he writes about what it was like to know Poe as a kid. We've got another one that his friend John Sartain wrote about what it was like seeing Poe the last summer of his life when Poe was hallucinating and wasn't quite in good headspace. And they help build up the biography just as much as Poe's actual letters do, or the actual letters to and from Poe do, because they gives a little bit more context to thing. And one of the great things is a lot of these are contradictory because people have their own motives, and some people want to give themselves a bigger part to play within the Poe story, and other people just don't want to be a part of it all, so they try to keep their name out of it. So you have to realize that it's all sort of subjective, and everybody's unreliable, including Poe, because Poe used to tell people that he'd graduated first in his class at UVA, then gone off to Europe to fight the Greek Wars of Independence, but was captured and sent to St. Petersburg, Russia. All lies. He dropped out of college after one semester. Then he was an enlisted man for 2 years before he went to West Point. So he just sort of cuts out the middle part there and just says, oh, yeah, I was in Europe. And he told so many people that during his lifetime that he actually wrote it into articles that they were writing for him. They said, can you give us information about you? He said, oh, yeah, I was in the Greek Wars of Independence, just like Lord Byron. So if you read accounts of Poe's life from his lifetime, that's what's in it. It wasn't until like 40 years after his death that they finally figured out, oh, yeah, that was all made up.
How fascinating. And I mean that he was such a colorful character, and I know that there has been a bit of controversy about him and things. Can you go in a little bit to some of the controversial aspects other than him, faking parts of his biography? But what other things have really stood out to you?
Well, one thing is they're not exactly sure how he died. So that's still a mystery. He died in a hospital, but his first biographer despised Poe, and he would say, oh, Poe was a drunkard, he was a drug addict, he was a scoundrel. And before you know it, people thought, oh, he must have died drunk in a gutter. And then his attending physician, he started spreading stories about Poe's death, but also the man who took him to the hospital. His name was Joseph Snodgrass, and he was a big temperance advocate because the temperance movement was really growing during Poe's lifetime. It was going to be not till decades later in the 1920s that they actually banned alcohol, but this Snodgrass, he wrote articles and gave lectures about how the evils of alcohol killed this great writer and you should ban alcohol. We wouldn't have to go through this again. But then Poe's attending physician, John Moran, he responded by writing articles where he said that, oh no, Poe was sober on his deathbed, and I offered him whiskey like any good doctor would, and he turned it down and says, I'll have nothing to do with that demon rum. At one point, he said Poe's last word was nevermore, because it sounded more dramatic. Another point, he said it was Lord help my poor soul. And he kept changing the circumstances of Poe's death. He kept changing the story. He had Poe reciting beautiful speeches on his deathbed, which is all contradicting the earlier things that Moran wrote about Poe. So Moran's contradicting himself, in addition to contradicting Snodgrass, who wasn't even there when Poe died. And then old Rufus Griswold, his first biographer, he added some flair to it all too. So there's a lot of controversy about what are the facts and who was sort of trying to serve their own agenda. Maybe Moran wanted to show himself as the great doctor and friend of Poe, even though that's the first time they ever met. And Snodgrass had his agenda, Griswold had his agenda. And there's also controversy about, well, what happened to Poe's father? He just sort of dropped off the face of the earth. And back then in 1810, you could do that. There's no credit cards, no internet. And there's various references to him in letters. Some say that he died a couple weeks after Poe's mother died. Some say he died a little bit before. Others say he abandoned the family. There's a David Poe who turned up in a debtor's prison in New York about that time, but we don't know what happened to him after that. There's a letter that says, oh, Mr. and Mrs. Poe have quarreled and parted ways. So that's something that's still up for debate. And depending on when he disappeared, that caused people to doubt, well, is Poe's sister's father the same father as Edgar's father, as Edgar's? And also people have a lot of questions about Poe's marriage, because he was 27, he married a 13-year-old.
Right.
And what's the story behind that? And why does it seem like her mother, who is Poe's aunt, was sort of encouraging the union? And it's probably because if the aunt got her daughter married off, that would ensure she had a place to live, because she was a widow and she had nowhere else to go. So that would ensure that she had a home too. But why did Poe marry her? And about the time he married her, I'm sure he loved her in his own way, but he refers to her as my darling cousin, my little wifey,
Mhm.
my sissy. So he thinks of her like a little sister, a little wife. So it's not the typical marriage that you would expect. So what was the nature of their marriage? And people have been trying to figure that out. And the mother-in-law says, well, for the first several years, they were married in name, they're legally married, but they were in separate rooms. And then after the wife got older, her name was Virginia, she got sick, she had tuberculosis, so he kept her in a separate room then, because back then they thought tuberculosis could be just spread by miasma or unclean air. So if they put her in the attic, the air was fresher because it's farther from the street. The street's covered in horse dung and it's smelly and it's filthy. But if you put her higher up, she'll be above all that. So that'll make her feel better.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
just it didn't really help much, but that was just one idea they had. And she seems to have really loved Edgar too, but there's only a spattering of her words that still survive. We've got a little letter in which she is quoted. It's Frances Osgood. I told you about her earlier. Her relationship with Poe was so scandalous that a lady called Elizabeth Elliot, who stopped by Poe's house, said that she saw an indiscreet letter from Frances to Edgar lying on a table in his house, and she read it, because that's, of course, what you do. You read other people's letters. And she said, oh, whatever's in there was so awful she couldn't tell you, but it terrified her. It was so terrible. She can't tell you what it says, but she'll let everybody's imagination run wild, like, oh, maybe Poe's the father of Fannie Faye. Maybe they had a love child. Maybe there's something else going on. And before you know it, this was a huge scandal. So we've got a letter where Frances is writing to Elizabeth Elliot saying, knock it off. Stop spreading these rumors. For the sake of my husband and my children, we can't bear to hear Poe's name ever again. And then she has a little quote from Virginia Poe in there saying how this is going to kill her. She doesn't have much longer to live. And please stop spreading these rumors. So we've got that. But the best firsthand testimony we have from Poe's wife is a love poem she wrote to Edgar. It's a Valentine's poem from 1846. And basically she writes about how all she wants is to move to a cottage in the countryside where the fresh air could heal her weakened lungs. So yeah, she wrote a love poem about her tuberculosis. And she says she wants to escape the city and the tattling of many tongues. So she wants to escape all the gossip. But it just shows that she really is devoted to Edgar, even if their relationship wasn't the typical one today. We don't know if they ever, well, they never had any kids, so we know that much. So, but the rest of it's all speculation, and there's a lot of people who get into a lot of speculation about things like, oh, this story, maybe this is referencing this, but it's all speculation at that point. And she did grow up eventually, and at that time, a girl in Virginia could legally get married at age 12, so they weren't doing something that was outside the norm back then. But today, when we look back and we say, no, they shouldn't have been doing that back then.
How fascinating. And there, you're right, because when you read different posts or watch videos about people speculating about things, I mean, that obviously is very controversial, and not legal now. And that is interesting that the law was different. And, I'm from Utah, so I'm there, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, they were known for having multiple underage wives and things. But what are some of the things, when you look back at some of the controversies that have been created that aren't factual, that have been based in others just trying to work it for their own gain?
Well,
What are some of those examples?
There's a review from the Southern Literary Messenger. It's a magazine in Richmond that Poe's editing, and it's from about 1836 or 1835. And it's a review of a book called Slavery in America. And it's a review of a pro-slavery book. And the review is pretty pro-slavery too. Like, oh, slaves like being slaves. It's fun for them. And they love, their master telling them everything what to do. And at some point, some people decide Poe must have written that essay. But there's a surviving letter where Poe writes to the author of it, Nathaniel Beverly Tucker, and says, "I got the essay you wrote. I had to cut some parts out of it." So we know that Poe didn't write it, but there's still anthologies out there that say, "Oh, yeah, Poe loved slavery because of this essay." But it turns out, no, Poe never wrote that. And we even have like some books that included in it. So there's a book that was all about Poe and race in the 19th century that included in it. And I think that's sort of given some people the wrong impression of it. I remember there was a novelist, a pretty major novelist in the 20th century, who said that to understand race in the 19th century, you really have to understand Poe's works. And his novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, is all about race because it's all these symbols of whiteness destroying everything. But then she forgot, well, it's set in Antarctica. There's snow everywhere. Of course, there's a lot of white snow everywhere.
How fascinating.
It has nothing to do with race. It has to do with, the snow's white.
Wow.
They're trying to find symbolism where there's not symbolism just so they can promote their thesis.
How fascinating. Yeah, then I'm sure a lot of people attach their own ideas to Poe's work, and that must be frustrating for you as somebody who spent so much time doing what you've done, researching him and being the curator for the museum. That's got to be a little frustrating to see some of the misinformation put forward about him.
And especially when I was way to tell everybody that, literature shouldn't be didactic. We're not here to teach you a lesson. We're here to entertain you. And he tried to write entertaining stories, things that would thrill you and chill you. And there were other writers of his time who were very didactic, and they'd be very political, and they wanted poetry to teach you a moral lesson. He said, no, it shouldn't teach you anything. It should impact your emotions. That's why I guess Ralph Waldo Emerson, who really thought that, poetry should teach you about the greater truths of life and the universe and everything else. He called Poe that old jingle man because he thought, oh, Poe just writes pretty poetry. Oh, there's Lily.
Well, I heard the little cat fight earlier.
Yeah, they've been running around attacking each other all night.
Well, I know some people that are listening to the show are going to be happy to see a baby. I just have to give Amy a shout out. Amy has a cat, Dinah, and I love it. My cat, I'm surprised, isn't here either. What a cutie. Oh my gosh.
Well, there's Macy. Macy couldn't let her be up here by herself.
Oh my goodness.
And she's a little torty.
Oh, how beautiful. Oh, I love it. And they sound like they have a good time together.
Oh yeah, they're good buddies.
Oh, I love it. How old are they?
Let's see. Lily's about 2 years old, and she was found in the crawl space underneath the house. And the lady who used to live there was named Lil. So I thought, oh, Lily. And of course, Macy's our storm drain cat.
Oh, that is so cool. I love it. Thank you. That actually makes my night seeing your babies. They're so cute. And so with all the controversy surrounding him, what are some of the things, what are some of the disappointments about him as you've kind of learned more insight about him? What are some things that have really inspired you about him as an individual, and what are things that have disappointed you as you have dug into his life?
I'm kind of inspired that he just never gave up, because you keep seeing these letters after letter. He keeps trying different things, trying to find a way to support his wife, but he really, in the end, couldn't do it. There's nothing he could have done to have saved her with what they knew back then. They didn't have antibiotics back then. She was dying of tuberculosis. So you see this hope that keeps building up, and he keeps thinking that he can somehow save her, that, oh, maybe if I get a government job, or maybe if I study for the bar and become a lawyer, maybe there's something can work out, or maybe if I start my own magazine. And so he keeps having these ideas, and one after another, they keep failing. The the Washington, D.C. job he thought he had didn't pan out. And then sometimes he's his own worst enemy. And that's one thing that really bothers me. Sometimes we can look back with hindsight and say, you know what, dude, you just quit your job because you want to start your own magazine. How about you suck it up and stay there until you get the funding for your magazine first and then quit the job? But sometimes he's just so impetuous that he ruins his own chances to do things. And like there's once he was at the Southern Literary Messenger, that magazine in Richmond, and he heard that his cousin Virginia was going to move in with a different cousin and not him. So he just runs off to Baltimore and loses his job here in Richmond. And he could have just said, yeah, hey, boss, I need to take a week off to go up and get my cousin, keep her from living with my other cousin. And instead, he just took off and he got fired and he had to come back and plead for his job back. And there's so many stories like that where he gets himself in trouble. And sometimes, it's not entirely his fault. Like at the University of Virginia, he dropped out because he just did not have enough money. He had about a third of the money he needed. So where are you going to come up with hundreds of dollars? He tried anything he could. He borrowed money. He gambled. He tried what he could. They didn't have McDonald's then, so you couldn't get a part-time job at McDonald's after class. So he was trying what he could. But then there's other instances, especially a lot of those magazine jobs, he'd hold the job for maybe a year and then he'd get himself fired. And you do have to root for him sometimes because he just never gave up. But then other times you can see he is his own worst enemy. And he wrote about this in his stories. That's why he kind of knew what he was doing, I think. And The Black Cat, it's such a good example. He writes about that feeling within yourself, is an urge within yourself that's beyond your own conscious control that makes you do the wrong thing for the wrong thing's sake. And also an imp of the perverse. He calls it the imp of the perverse, this little imp that lives inside of you. And he describes it as what makes you do something horrible that you shouldn't do, that you shouldn't do, that you don't want to do. Like when you're standing on the edge of a cliff and you feel the urge to get a little bit closer, a little bit closer, a little bit closer, even though if you fall, you're toast. But what is that thing pulling you closer to the edge? So Poe knew there was something that was pulling him along and making him do the wrong thing, making him cause trouble for himself. When there's these times, especially when he's working at this Graham's magazine in Philadelphia, very popular magazine, making $800 a year, that's good money back then. But he saw, the boss is making $25,000. The boss is loaded. He's rich. This is before you really talked about millionaires. You talked about people with like thousands of dollars back then. So it's like, well, if I started my own magazine, did things my own way, I wouldn't have to listen to him anymore. But that also cost him that regular paycheck he had. And before you know it, he was in dire straits. If Poe had just sucked it up, maybe. But that's not who he is.
And thank you for that, being so candid about that. That it's funny. Artists are just, there are lots of quirks, and they are a lot of times, not always, but they are, we can be our own worst enemies in a lot of ways. And it is interesting to see that expressed through his writing. Who were his male friends? Did he have any good friends that were by his side?
Well, there's John Hamilton Mackenzie, who was probably Poe's first friend. I mean, when Poe was like 3 years old and John was 5, John was the foster brother of Poe's sister. So when Poe, was orphaned at age 2, he went to live with the Allan family. His little sister Rosalie, who's only about a year old, she went to live with the Mackenzie family. So that meant John Mackenzie was her older brother, her older foster brother. And when he was about 5 years old, his mother forced him to play with little Edgar. Because John he was a real little rascal. Apparently he was playing on the stairs, chasing a little girl he liked, and he fell and broke his arm. And his mother said, "Oh no, you've got to stay inside." And then he climbs a tree, breaks his arm, and then he apparently was jumping on a bed, broke his arm. So she said, "That's it. You need to entertain this little kid." And he just started entertaining him by telling him stories. And that's, before you know it, that's what sparked something in Poe. And he started telling the older kids stories. So they would tell each other little fairy tales and stuff. But now the little kids entertain the older kid. So that's maybe how Poe got started as a storyteller. But then, like years later, Poe's 40 years old and they're still friends. And throughout his life, Poe was in need of money. He took out a lot of loans, and John Mackenzie said he would always loan him money knowing he'd never get paid back, but that's not what it's about. He was loyal to Poe. I mean, he disagreed about some things. He understood that Poe could have been a better husband, that he could have helped care for his wife better, that if he'd stayed at that magazine job, he wouldn't have had so much trouble taking care of her. But he always understood that despite Poe's weaknesses, despite his problems, that he was a good and loyal friend. And I think that's really says something. These are been friends for what time you're 5 until you're 40, or that's a lifelong friend. That's a pretty special thing. But he had other lifelong friends, like there was Rob Stannard, who was one of his close friends throughout his life, who loaned him a lot of money that he never paid him back. But Poe's friends oftentimes didn't loan him the money because they expected to be paid back. They loaned it because this is somebody they loved, and they knew there's something different about him. And even that guy whose job he quit, Graham's magazine, the owner, George Rex Graham, still thought Poe was the greatest guy and still bought his stories from him, kept paying him money to write stories for the magazine, even though he left. And same thing, Nathaniel Parker Willis was one of his friends up in New York. So there were people who were really close to him and stayed loyal to him. And there are other people who just couldn't stand him, like old Rufus Griswold. I think nobody really liked Rufus Griswold. Like when he died, his body sat in a receiving tomb for years because nobody claimed the body, nobody gave him burial. They're like, yeah, well, okay, what happened to him? His kids sold off his books and said, yeah, do what you want. I think the idea was the kids were supposed to sell off his library so they could get him a nice monument to himself. And instead they said they sold off the books and kept the money.
Well, way to win friends and influence people. Not. Yeah. Wow. That does say something, that he had those lifelong friends that were very devoted to him.
Yeah. And then he still had some enemies. And sometimes people would be friends for a little while, like James Russell Lowell, who was an abolitionist and writer from up in Massachusetts. And they were friends at first. And Lowell published The Telltale Heart in his magazine. And he was a supporter of Poe's and wrote a really glowing biographical sketch of him for a magazine. But then they had a falling out. And sometimes Poe he would drink too much and he'd just have a complete change in personality, and people wouldn't recognize him after he'd had something to drink. It took maybe a glass of wine and he's staggering drunk. And that's what happened to him when he tried to get his job in Washington, D.C. He wanted to get a job in the Tyler administration, a government appointment to a customs house, because there weren't a lot of professional writers back then. Most of the professional writers we think of were professors, or they were lawyers. They had family money. They worked in customs houses. And when he got to D.C., somebody offered him a drink at a party, and before you know it, he's embarrassing himself. So his friends who lived there just sort of quietly said, maybe you're not going to see him today. Maybe you don't get to see the president. You're sort of not in your best state right now. And he knew that his family's dependent upon him. He knew that his wife and his mother-in-law were back there waiting for him to return with good news, and he blew it. And you think, man, this was his chance. I mean, if he'd had a custom house job, he thought he could work from maybe 10 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon, spend the rest of his time writing. And that might have given him a comfortable lifestyle, but that's just not who he was. It just didn't work out.
And his life is just tragic in so many so many ways with the people that he watched die, at such a young age. He had so many people in his life that died, and just to just to hear about his self-sabotage in
Yeah.
some of these efforts, that's heartbreaking. And again, he brought that upon himself. So it's kind of it's an interesting thing. What are some of the qualities that you admire the most about him?
Refusing to just do what others have done and believing that what he was doing was worth doing in spite of everything. And we're talking about a guy who suffered with poverty and rejection and loss, and the people he really cared about dying around him and him being really powerless to do anything about it, and at times wanting to end it all. But in the last year of his life, it's 1849, everybody's running out west, to find gold. And he wrote to one of his friends, that he wouldn't give up the life of a writer for all the gold in California. It's the only profession befitting a man, that this is something that he could enjoy, that he always explained it like it was the joy of being able to see the bright, shining sun and the sea, and to really experience beauty in a way that others couldn't. This is a guy who, in the end, in spite of everything, he'd never give it up. Most people would say, man, if I could go back in time, I'd do everything differently. But he's saying, no, in spite of everything, it was worth it. And it's so great how it just reminds me of something he wrote when he was about 20. He wrote that I know I'm a poet, because no one who worships beauty the way I do couldn't be a poet. And I give the world to embody just half the ideas that float in my imagination. So isn't that a great mission statement, to just give birth to even half those ideas that are flowing around in your head? I mean, to devote your life to the imagination, but not just imagining it, to putting it on paper, recording it so other people can share in it. And it's worth more to him than all the gold in California.
Wow.
Maybe if he'd gone to California, he wouldn't have died, because he died later that year. Or maybe he would have died in California instead.
And you reminded me, I remember the last time that I talked to you, I thought it was really interesting that you were mentioning when he was, the conspiracies, the things around his death, the unanswered questions. And you had mentioned that there were political parties in that day that would find people and kind of sequester them in a house or a place for a few days to get them to vote for a specific party. Can you talk a little bit about that again? Not to change the subject, but I just found you were mentioning his death, and I just found that really fascinating.
Yeah, this Poe was found 4 days before his death. He was semi-conscious, dressed in somebody else's clothes, at a polling place in Baltimore on election day. So almost immediately people thought, oh, this guy's been cooped. And since we've been able to check the old newspapers, you see that there were warnings in the newspapers: beware of the Fourth Ward polls, that the Whigs are up to their old tricks again. And Baltimore at that time was known as Mob Town. It was a lawless sort of place. And cooping was basically finding people from out of town that nobody had missed, nobody recognized. And Poe's from out of town. He's passing through Baltimore, his way from Richmond up to New York. He'd been living in Philadelphia for 6 years, and New York City for 3 years, then the Bronx for 3 years. So it'd been a while since he'd been living in Baltimore, and there weren't a lot of people there who would have recognized him, especially since he'd grown a mustache since he'd last been there. So maybe some people who didn't know who he was, they found him, drugged him, and used him as a repeat voter. And back then, there weren't a whole lot of people who could vote. You had to be white, male, property owners, over 21. So you had to convince each polling place. There's an election judge. You could either bribe or convince the election judge that you were who you were and you were eligible to vote. You had no photo ID. The most you had was an ID that would say things like hair color brown, face shape oval. It would give your height and your weight. But as long as you were the same general size and build of the person you're saying you were, you could be that person. So it looks like either the election judge of the Fourth Ward polls was bribed or they were threatened. But apparently their last name was Reynolds, which is pretty interesting because Poe's last words when he was on his deathbed, he screamed the name Reynolds over and over again. So maybe that has something to do with what's going on. But once they got them to vote, they get them past the election judge. They sign their X in the line to vote. They drag them all back. All these people have been cooped up together, switch their clothes. And then you have them vote again. And you can just have them vote over and over again, just change their clothes each time. You say, oh, didn't I see you here last time? Oh, no, I was wearing a different hat that time. But these people who were cooped were often, they were drugged or they drunk. They had no idea really what they were doing. All they had to do was just sign their X line and then move on, and they do it again. Sometimes they drag them to multiple polling places to have them vote over and over again. And since there were fewer people voting back then, it was easier to influence an election that way. So if you had 20 people cooped up, you could maybe get 100 votes out of them. They just voted 5 times apiece.
Wow.
And that could really sway an election. And this was a municipal election, so it wasn't like you're voting the presidential election. So you really had a chance to make a difference here. So maybe Poe died from voting. It's
That
probably
is
one
fascinating.
of many factors. And one of his sort of early biographers, a friend of his, John Reuben Thompson, wrote a lecture about Poe, and he said that it was ironic that here Poe was a guy who never voted, and it's probably voting that led to his death.
That is, that is really interesting to know that that was going on at that time, and that could have potentially happened to him. And thank you for going over that again. I just, that really, when I interviewed you last, that was something that really stuck out to me. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, like now we know who Poe was. We recognize him from all the photographs we've seen him, but in his time they might not have recognized him. The photographs hadn't been published during his lifetime. All you saw of him were a couple engravings. There was this wood engraving where he doesn't even have the mustache, and then there's a steel engraving where he doesn't look anything like any of the photos. So maybe if you happen to be reading the magazine, you saw this engraving, you held it up next to him, maybe you recognize him or maybe not, because it really doesn't look a whole lot like him. Now we're just so spoiled that we're used to seeing photographs of people, videos of people, and if you're famous, it means people know what you look like. But back then, Washington Irving was famous, but you only knew him through engravings. You didn't actually get to see him in person.
Right. And now with AI, that just opens up a whole, that's another topic. But I want to ask you, because you do some amazing lectures, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the Victorian spiritualism.
Oh, it's a fascinating time. I like that era because it's sort of the last half of the 19th century, and we're on the cusp of modernity. Think of all the inventions that are coming out during the 19th century: locomotives, the daguerreotype, the first really successful photographic process, the telegraph. It's like magic. You can communicate with somebody far away from you, and here you are, you can make a portrait of somebody just using light and chemicals. So we're on the cusp of the modern world. We have technologies that just a couple generations earlier people would not have believed existed. Poe wrote a whole story about this, about as like a sequel to the 1001 Nights, and Scheherazade is telling her 1002nd story, which is all about this strange world where people travel in a giant steel machine and they take photographs. So modern world, and it's just so unbelievable that her husband's up killing her because he doesn't believe it. So we're living in that world where so many things are so close to being modern. At the same time, there's still doctors out there who say, they look you up and down and say, you know what your problem is? You got too much blood. Let's just cut open a vein, bleed you a little bit. Or, oh, you're having mental illness? Oh, let's just waterboard you. They call it the spread eagle cure. They strap you to the table, turn you upside down, pour water on your head. That'll cure them good. So were at the same time very primitive and almost modern, to the point that they feel like, well, we must be modern. Look at our factories we're building in these modern cities. Some of these buildings are 4 stories tall. I mean, they're huge, they're enormous. And at this time, when we're really in touch with the new technology and what can technology do and how can we conquer science, people got very interested in, well, can we communicate with the dead? How can that happen? And one of the side effects of having big cities was also having health scares, like the big cholera pandemic of 1832 that wiped out millions of people. And all of a sudden, there's a huge chunk of the population who isn't there anymore. But there are also great wars, like later the Civil War, which was a decade or so after Poe's death. And all of a sudden, these people, sometimes you'd come back and the city would have a quarter of the young men were gone now, or half the young men were gone from a small town. And people wanted to get in touch with those lost ones. How can we get in touch with them? And how can we use modern technology? And one of the new sciences was animal magnetism, developed by a fellow named Mesmer. That's why we call it mesmerism. And he believed that there was a magnetic force running through all matter, animate and inanimate alike. And if you could control the magnetic forces, you could, say, heal somebody, or you could control their mind or control their behavior. And of course, it was ripe for fraud. And before you know it, there are quack mesmerists who are really making fools of people. And it lost a lot of its credibility because of that. But by the 1840s, people were actually really interested in mesmerism. They're performing surgeries. A doctor, because they didn't have modern anesthesia, they would mesmerize a patient to see if that would alleviate the pain during surgery. And people got very interested. Poe actually wrote a story about a fellow who, on his deathbed, told his doctors to mesmerize him. But he accidentally died, and he was still in a mesmeric trance. But he wouldn't die because he was in the trance. He was still in a state of suspended animation. And for 7 months, they were still able to communicate with him. And finally, this fellow, his name was Mr. Valdemar, said, "I am dead, let me die." And they woke him from his trance, and he dissolved into a pool of goo before their very eyes, or a loathsome mass of detestable putrescence. And people thought that was a true story because they wanted to believe that that was a true story. So they rushed out. They bought the magazine. It was reprinted in medical journals. And the Popular Record of Modern Science in London reprinted the story as if it were true. And people wrote to Poe and said, "This story is true after all, isn't it? You're only pretending it was a hoax. It really was true." And about this same time, a fellow named Andrew Jackson Davis picked up on some of these ideas. And he was a trance mesmerist, or he'd go into a trance, and he'd use it on stage. So think Edgar Casey, think going into a trance, and you have somebody there, you dictate what you see, and they write it all down. So he would go on into his trance state, and his friend would write down everything he's saying. He says that once you're in a trance state, and this is something a lot of people believed, including Poe wrote about this in one of his letters, that you're free of your body. So because you're free of your mortal coil, there's nothing impeding you from seeing the spirits that are around you. And Andrew Jackson Davis, said he would communicate with other spirits. He also said that he would see the afterlife, a place called Summerland, and he wrote a whole book describing what Summerland was like. And then you don't really hear much about Andrew Jackson Davis now. His archives are actually at the Association for Research and Enlightenment here in Virginia. It was where Edgar Casey was. That was his center, but they ended up buying the archives. And so he's setting this up that people really want to find ways to communicate with the dead, and mesmerism was one of those ways. But then I think the reason you never hear about Andrew Jackson Davis anymore is because about March of 1848, he said, I have a vision that something amazing has happened, It's going to shake the world. Nothing's ever going to be the same again. And about the time he said that, in Hydesville, New York, these little sisters, just little girls, the Fox sisters, started hearing knocking sounds, which they interpreted as being the knockings of a spirit. And before you know it, the modern spiritualist movement was born. So mesmerism, which was still considered kind of a new science back then, that was one of the ways that they were trying to communicate with the dead and trying to communicate with spirits that might still be out there. But the Fox sisters and their followers really took off. So one of the big things you'd hear was knockings or rappings. Like you say, oh, I want the spirit to rap once for yes, twice for no. And you would get them to, oh, I have two cats in my lap now. And Macy just sat on top of Lily. So Lily just growled at her. That wasn't my stomach growling. So this is really spreading around the globe before you know it. So by the time you had the Civil War, that got a lot of people interested in spiritualism, but also World War I got people interested in spiritualism all over again. And it really surged in popularity throughout the Victorian era. So what really interested me was this combination of science, pseudoscience, the latest in technology from their point of view, plus the old-time religion and superstition and the intersection of all these, because people are approaching these new technologies from what they already know. What do they believe about spirits? And a lot of the older ghost stories you hear aren't the same as later ghost stories, because people had different ideas of, say, in Poe's day, they believed in helper spirits who basically are there to help you and to guide you. So if you lost your money, they might lead you to a buried treasure or something. But there are also Afro-Caribbean superstitions and religions that were getting to the fold. And like here in Virginia, about 30 miles south of Richmond, there's this house that was built with the aid of, he was from the Caribbean and he believed in hoodoo. And he told the owner of the house that the house needs to be built with no right angles, because ghosts can only occupy homes where the walls are at right angles. So you need to have weird shaped rooms to keep the ghost out. So it sounds a little bit like, the Winchester house,
Right.
except that was a little bit more extensive. This guy didn't have quite that much money, so it's not as big a house, but you will notice the walls don't connect at right angles. And hoodoo had different beliefs about how you could communicate with the spirits and how they could guide you. So a lot of it's about guidance and communication with the spirits. Nowadays, a lot of times with our modern technology, we think more, maybe ghosts are just residual hauntings. They're sort of stuck to the environment, almost like the little metal strip on the tape recorder. If anybody still remembers what tape recorders have, they have little strips inside the tape, cassette tapes. They're kind of like this old-fashioned version of MP3s.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we used to have to use back in the olden days, even though we knew they were horrible. And then after you played them too many times, the tape would get all like unwound.
I have so many cassette tapes. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
So even now we're trying to understand what a ghost is, but we're coming from a different perspective. It's, there must be a scientific explanation for it. Like maybe it is somehow it's attached to the type of soil that's underneath the house, or maybe the house itself, or maybe some violent action has imprinted itself on the house. And then, or maybe a poltergeist is something else entirely, since, they link poltergeist very often to there being a young girl living in the house. Maybe it's somehow connected to that. But in the 19th century, they're thinking about ghosts from a different perspective. Like, well, these are our helper spirits, and they're here to warn us. There's omens, and if we know how to read the omens, we know how to communicate with them, that they're here to help us. So it's interesting to see different perspectives on what their belief was in ghosts and the afterlife and hauntings and everything else. I always think of it, it's like if you have an airplane and a hummingbird and a bumblebee, they all fly, right? But they're not the same thing. So just lumping ghost all under the same word doesn't really describe each of those things because they all completely different.
And it is interesting just to see how, you mentioned times of unrest. I mean, points in time like we're experiencing now, for example, where there is that people are in a joint like crisis. This is like a, and so people do turn to different things in times of crisis. But what were some of the beliefs during the world wars? What with regard, and how did spiritualism change from the knockings and the way we communicated back then, and the beliefs around that?
Well, it's changed quite a bit. In Poe's day, we had a lot of the trance mediums where you go into a trance, you do automatic writing, you just write down whatever the spirit gives you. And people were writing books. After Poe's death, mediums channeled Poe and they said, oh, these are poems that Poe wrote after he died by way of this medium or that medium. So trance mediums who were in this mesmeric condition, they would be one of the big ones. And then also at the same time, the ones who just have knockings who for some reason or other consider themselves sensitive. We don't know what would make somebody sensitive. Usually they were young women or young girls. And the Fox sisters were the best example, but there were plenty of others who came along after them. Sometimes they would work as sisters, sometimes just be one. The Fox sisters, one of them actually confessed later they're just cracking the knuckles on their toes, and that's where the knocking sound came from. But then all of a sudden it became more and more elaborate. Knocking wasn't enough anymore. And there was a couple of brothers who they'd put themselves behind a curtain in this little room, and then they'd be tied up. And these musical instruments would start playing. And then when it was done, they'd pull back the curtain, and now those two brothers are still tied up back there. And people thought that was the ghost. Now we know Harry Houdini taught everybody how to do it, but basically they just got out of the ropes, played the instruments, and then got back in the ropes. But there were tables tipping, and after a while, a table tipping up on end wasn't enough, so the table had to levitate, and then things would be falling out of the sky. And we had developed into the modern seance, from sort of the trance mesmerist working alone to a seance where everybody sits around a table together. And automatic writing developed into using a different device or a planchette where everybody puts their fingers on it and it rolls and it writes, sort of like with the Ouija board, except a little pencil on it, so you could write down whatever the spirit communicated with you. And of course, the Ouija board came along even after that. So here in Virginia, there's nearby, I think the letters are from right about 1900, that this woman's writing her sister saying we've been experimenting with the Ouija board and that it's unleashed spirits into our house. So this was really popular and people were trying to find different ways. And so the seance in Poe's time was much simpler than it later became. It later became a lot more dramatic and a lot more ripe for fraud. A lot of magicians were pulling things off, and the famous examples, the ectoplasm. And when you actually see the ectoplasm, they were amazed. Oh, this weird white substance is coming in their mouth. Now they just put like tissue in their mouth and pull it out, or they put cheesecloth in their mouth and are pulling out. And the height really seemed to be World War One, when we were seeing death on an unprecedented scale. Kids. I think it really came to a head when Harry Houdini's mother died. And Harry Houdini, at the early part of his career, had been a fake spiritualist. So he'd preyed on people. He'd had all the tricks. He'd have somebody go to town ahead of him and write down the names from recent graves. And he'd pretend he was communicating with those people. Oh, I just delivered the name of John Smith. And they said, oh, there's a John Smith who just died here. And so he knew the tricks. He knew how to pretend that these blank slates suddenly had writing on them. So he knew what the tricks of the trade were. But Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, also a huge Poe fan, he was a very devout spiritualist, and he had a favorite medium he worked with. And when you say medium, they think just like the medium of communication. Like today, a medium would be your cell phone used to communicate with somebody far away. Back then, that person was the cell phone. They used to call them the spiritual telegraph. They're the ones who help you communicate with someone far away, or in this case, somebody who might be nearby that you just can't see or hear. And that's basically what they're trying to do. They're trying to use whatever they have to communicate with those people they can't communicate with. And after Houdini's mother died, he went to everybody to try to find if they could help him communicate with her, and nobody could. And then Sir Arthur Conan Doyle said, well, my medium, she'll help you out. And she wrote a message that said something to the effect of, may the love of Christ be with you. And she drew a heart on the top and said, this is a message from your mother. And Houdini said, my mother's Jewish. She never would have written that. Houdini set out to take down every fake medium he could find. And that meant going in disguise to different seances. And then when he saw somebody's hiding inside that cabinet back there, he'd flip on the lights and reveal them. And people began to dread that he'd show up. So he'd have his assistants go there in disguise and bust all the fake mediums. And then by the 20s, you have laws cracking down on fortune telling or seances. So we take it for granted now that if you want your fortune told, you can go to stores, you can go to places and people will do their tarot cards for you. You can buy tarot cards online. But back then, the 20s, they were really cracking down on that. And I think that's really sort of sent the spiritualist movement underground. It had this real peak by World War I, but by the 1920s, it was back underground. And with modern technology, we're finding new ways, although our new ways to communicate with the spirits look really nothing like they did back in Poe's day. Now we're using EMF detectors, electromagnetic fields. If you told somebody in Poe's day that, they'd have no idea what you're talking about. They didn't have the terminology for it, but they did have the terminology for animal magnetism and mesmerism. Those are the technologies they had back then. Now we've got infrared photography. We've got video technology. We can just set up some video cameras and audio recorders in a room and leave it there and see what happens. And in Poe's day, you were the video camera. You had to be there to see this because that's the best you had. And it wasn't until a little bit later that they started taking photographs and say, hey, there's some of that photograph that wasn't there when I took it. Now we can take videos and say, well, there's some shape that's about 10 degrees colder than all the stuff around that seems to be moving through there. We don't know why it's moving through there. So that's, I guess, in a roundabout way, that's what interested me in Victorian spiritualism, is that's their high-tech stuff back then.
Well, that's fascinating. And do you feel that anybody, because you mentioned the sisters that were eventually, they admitted, one of them admitted that they were causing the hello, Jack. Jack was, he's behind the scenes lending moral support, and he just had to pop in for a second. But I mean, do you find that a majority of the people that jumped on into these movements were misguided? Do you find that a lot of them were grifters? Who would you say was actually genuine in what they were doing and experiencing?
I hate to say, I think maybe a few of them, like, I don't have any evidence, but it seems like Edgar Cayce really believed what he was saying. I don't think he was trying to scam people. He wasn't trying to get rich. You can sort of see others that, oh yeah, they're definitely trying to get rich, especially some of the cold readers who just, they say, oh, there's someone here with a J name. I sense a J name. Is it Jack, Jill, Jane? And then you can tell that the ones who, they just want to be on TV or they want to make a lot. But he didn't seem like he was ever about it. This was really sort of an extension of his religious experience. He felt he had a calling to do this. So there's a few that I think really believed it, and there's a lot who are really just for the money. And fortunately, I guess people who are in for the money probably get a whole lot more followers than people who are just gradually helping people one person at a time.
It really is interesting, and I think COVID it was very fascinating from the perspective that you had this all these people that were turning to online communities, and Lord knows who you were communicating with and what their intention was, and it was, I saw all of these wonderful people in health and wellness that turned to, they were new agey spiritualism, but then they went straight down a really negative path of believing conspiracy theories and not trusting um, the government, or different ways that I think that was exploited in a grand scheme, and that was really sad to me to see. Back before the internet, you didn't have the ability to do such damage that you
Yeah.
do now. And I look at people like, there's a woman named Teal Swan, and she's grown her online community and is a spiritualist, and among other things. But that is really fascinating to watch, and that must be, I think, that area of study for you, to look at all the different time periods and the way that was used and how people believed and were deceived. I mean, I think that is a fascinating topic.
Oh, yeah. And yeah, with social media, it's the best thing and the worst thing all together. I mean, social media allows you to make friends with somebody who's on the other side of the world. And it also allows you to post it there, hey, my cat's gotten out, and has anybody seen it? But at the same time, it also has made possible to amplify negativity sometimes. So you take the best and take the worst. But at
Right.
least it's a good place for cat videos.
That's true. I mean, it is fascinating. Like you said, there's the best and the worst, and we have all of this at our fingertips. And how do we, kind of educate ourselves? What do you think Poe would have done in a world like this?
I think he would have loved the internet because all the cat videos. He loved cats. He had one called Katarina. When he'd grown up, he had a little cat that he loved. So that would have been great. And in his time, the high tech thing were the newest printing presses. These really super powered, high speed printing presses. You went to, maybe you could do 60 papers printed an hour. Now you can have thousands of them. Now you had, a newspaper might have a circulation of 500 copies to ones where, the newspaper might have 40,000 copies per issue. And all of a sudden, there's this birth of the mass audience. And Poe knew that. And he said, the future of literature is magazine word. He knew that books were expensive. They took a long time to print. Not everybody could afford them. But everybody can afford the penny papers because they're a penny. And people could buy these cheap magazines. They can share them with friends. And at the end of the year, if you had a subscription to the magazine, you would bind it up into a big volume together. So you could hold on that magazine for a while. But Poe understood the technology was changing the way literature worked. Before, the main medium for the book was going to be the novel. Poetry books are also very popular, depending on who wrote them. If, say, it was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, his poetry, people were snatching that up. But people loved novels. And Poe's publishers early on said, oh, nobody wants to publish this book of short stories for you. You need to write a novel. And he actually wrote one novel because they kept saying, they want to write a novel, I'll give them a novel. But his heart was in short stories and serialized novels because that's what fit into the format of the magazine. People wanted their information faster than ever before. I mean, we can't wait a year for this new book. We're going to wait a month for it. We're going to read it in the next magazine, or we're going to have a weekly magazine. And Poe actually, for a while, worked at a weekly magazine in New York called the Broadway Journal. It also went out of business, but he knew technology was speeding up the way we absorbed information. So instead of writing long novels, he focused on short stories and short poems. Instead of these 500 or 1,000 line poems, have this long, elaborate story. He started off writing Tamerlane as 450 lines, and Alaraf was about 500 lines, and he compressed it down. He said, no, these things need to be short so you can read them in one sitting, so they fit in the format of the magazine. The Raven's 100-ish lines, but some of his poems are little sonnets, 14 lines, so they're short, they're compact. His short stories got shorter, more compact. If they did get long, serialize those things, print different installments. And he said, that's the way that story is going to work. And we want to be able to get our fiction, read it all in one sitting, all at once, get the whole emotional impact at the same time. Instead of, when you read a novel, you're going to read a chapter now, then go about your life, come back the next evening, read another chapter, and then come back the next evening, read another chapter. And real world interrupts the way you absorb that experience. For the short story, he said you should get the whole impact all at once. So he knew the short story was the wave of the future. But then magazines had their heyday in the 20th century, and you had all sorts of amazing magazines out there and the pulps, and it was a great medium for writers. And then a lot of writers specialized in short stories or novellas or things that they could print in the magazines. And a lot of those literary magazines have folded over the years. A lot of papers have folded over the years, and they're being replaced by things that are faster. And what would he be doing now? Would it be flash fiction? Would it be just writing little epigrams? Would it be something else entirely? Or would he be doing TikTok videos? Would you get the whole message absorbed in a 30-second video? He'd have to respond to the technology somehow, because he was always very interested in what technology can do to improve the experience of reading his stories. So in his day, the technology was the latest printing presses, woodblock engravings. Now, would it be a whole virtual experience? Would you be able to enter the holodeck and go inside of one of Poe's stories, and that would be how you experience it? Would you have to wear the goggles and enter into the world of one of his stories? Or would he decide to make his story into a video game so that the reader could actually choose their own fate? So I think what made him good was he did respond to the technology of his day, and it affected the way he wrote his stories. So today, with the internet, with virtual reality, with video games, with the way we absorb media at a faster rate than ever, he'd have to adapt to that.
That is really interesting. That would be fascinating to see what he would be like today. And would he have a TikTok? Would he? I mean, obviously, like you said, he did adapt, and he understood the way that people processed information, and that's really fascinating. Thank you for that. I would be fascinated. Maybe we should consult a spiritualist
Yeah.
and see if they could give us any input on that. Your cats are being naughty tonight.
Oh, they're having a good time. They love each other. They just run around chasing each other, knocking over stuff.
I love it. And so let me ask you too, because there's so many topics that you engage in and you lecture on, and I want to ask you, because it intrigues me, performance as Frankenstein's monster, engaging history productions.
Oh, that was a group up in Ashland, and that idea, they would do historical tea parties, kind of, and they invite people up to do a tea party to raise money for Hanover Tavern. And a lot of times I just say yes because it seems like it would be fun. And I always liked Boris Karloff, the 1931 Frankenstein, but also, of course, the 1935 Bride of Frankenstein, one of the few sequels that's better than the original. And they said, oh, would you like to be Frankenstein's monster for us? I said, sure thing, why not? And we worked then on a Poe tea. So after that, we did sort of a Poe tea, and I dressed up as Poe, and we had sort of a performance in between the different teas they served. And it all started, I guess there was some historical interpreters in town. I know a bunch of historical interpreters because I work in museums, and Around here, you got Colonial Williamsburg, which is loaded up with historical interpreters everywhere. And for some reason, that evening, whoever their Poe guy wasn't available, and they just called me up and said, "Hey, we pay cash if you want to come out here and be Poe for this reception." So, I got a top hat and got what I thought Poe would have worn, and just sort of showed up and spent the evening walking around talking an old timey accent and acting like I thought Poe would have acted. And then walking back to my car, some kid rode up to me on a bike and said, "Are you Edgar Poe?" And that somehow evolved into me doing performances as Poe. And then there's a choreographer who runs Aladdin Ballet, and she saw me and said, "Hey, let's do a Poe themed ballet, and we want you to sort of perform as Poe at the beginning of each performance." So we did the La Passion de Poe with Aladdin Ballet of Virginia, and that was a lot of fun. Just you would go up there on stage. I didn't have much to do because I'd come out dressed as Poe, introduce it, and read the bells and some other poems while they sort of danced around me. And then the real dancers came out. Like they had a guy, Antonio, who's from Spain. He used to drink Amontillado straight from the barrel when he was a kid, so he's got the Poe spirit in him, and he would do flamenco dancing dressed as Poe, and they would use the poems to tell the story of his life. So I know they had To Helen and To One in Paradise and Annabel Lee and The Raven. And on one occasion, he couldn't get here for the performance. He was stuck in Spain. He couldn't get back here. And the choreographer said, we just need somebody to fill in for him. And you've already got the costume. You're already Poe. I said, I can't dance. I'm not really graceful. And they said, "Oh, it's okay. You know where he stands. So basically, we're going to do the work for you. You just sort of walk where he would walk, because you've seen this so many times, you know where to go. And we'll just sort of dance around you, and it'll work. It'll totally work." So we did it. And then at the end, there's this part where Virginia's being pulled away from Poe, and the Raven comes out and he's pulling her away, and we're trying to pull her back. And then they finally get her away, and then Poe spins around, and there are these rose petals all over the floor. And then these spirits come out and surround him and torment him. And then he dies in the middle of the stage. So here I was, like, spinning around, and they don't tell you how slippery the floor is. Like the death part just goes splat. But I was staying down here. I'm dead, and it just worked perfectly.
Well, that is helpful.
Yeah. So
I bet that was a trip.
Yeah. So I like to try out different things, because if you had asked me, you said, "Oh, are you going to do any stuff with a ballet?" I said, "No, why would I do that? I can't even line dance. Why would I do ballet? I can't even do the Macarena."
Well, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody wants to see the Macarena. I remember I just have to go off on this little tangent. I was on a cruise, my one and only cruise, and I walked by late at night the ballroom, and there were a bunch of people doing the Macarena, and I thought, am I in hell? I'm walking by the gates of hell. So that's my Macarena thing. But what a gas to do that. And just be in that creative and watching all these people like a whirling dervish around you.
Yeah, it was cool to be in the middle of all that and see all the work they put into it. And they're the real deal. They're real dancers. They're practically flying around you and stuff. But I've been able to work with musicians, and there was a musician who did a composition for the piano that was based on the bells.
Ooh.
And it was sort of a special piano, so they were dropping little rubber balls inside of the piano to make strange sounds. And it's really interesting to be in the middle of that and see how these different people are interpreting some of the same stories and same poems in vastly different ways. So it's always interesting. I went to Providence once, and there's a woman who did a whole multimedia performance based on some of the women in Poe's life, and there were video screens all around and projections, and they were these disembodied spirits communicate with each other around the room, all through the magic of modern technology. But you never know what you're going to find next. Hopefully somebody will call tomorrow and say, hey, let's do one of those big 3D Poe experiences. Like they have the Van Gogh experience that travels around, and you sit in a room and they project Van Gogh's paintings all moving around the walls around you.
Mhm.
Why not do that with Poe? Why don't
That
you
would be so
go
amazing.
inside of the catacombs and get yourself bricked up behind the wall with Fortunato?
That sounds good to me.
Yeah.
So I've got to ask you, because Jeff is in chat, and I always appreciate what he has to say. He wanted to kind of throw this out. Has anybody read The Reason for the Darkness of the Night?
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that guy, the guy who wrote it, is very interested in 19th century science. That's his specialty, is the history of science. And how does that fit in with Poe? And Poe was very interested in science. He wrote articles about science. He considered his greatest work to be this long cosmological, philosophical, scientific essay called Eureka. It's a book-length essay about the universe, and he talks about how the universe is expanding, and he talks about the relationship between matter and energy and space and time and all this really forward-thinking stuff. And people have called this an early version of the Big Bang Theory. He talks about how there's one very dense particle, there's a Big Bang, everything expanded out from that. But he also talks about the paradox a lot of people had, that this primordial particle, if it's really that dense, it would probably just collapse in on itself. So he says at the beginning there was nothing, and from nothing came everything. And he proposes that there's even multiple universes, and that our universe sprang up from another universe through a similar, what we would call, black hole that implemented into our universe. But he's also writing about the daguerreotype and technologies like that, like anastatic printing, which sort of would have been comparable to what we have with a Xerox machine, that he could just write out with super neat handwriting his next manuscript, and he could just make facsimiles of that page instead of having to typeset the whole thing. It's a new printing technique. So he was interested in science, he was interested in technology, and he even wrote a book about seashells. Mostly he just wrote the introduction. The rest of it was just pretty much the standard information from other textbooks. It was a whole deal where the real conchologist who'd written a textbook on seashells, the book was so expensive he couldn't sell it as lectures, and he wanted to sell copies to the people who came to his lectures. So he paid Poe to write a cheap version of his own book, because his publishers wouldn't let him undersell his own book. So he said, I'll just get Poe to write it for me. So Poe wrote a book about seashells. So he's interested in conchology, and throughout his works, you can see he's interested in astronomy. There's extensive notes he's taken that still survive. They're up in Boston. It should be at the Poe Museum, but they're up in Boston instead. But he kept notes on gravity and the moon. And when he wrote his science fiction stories, he really tried to understand, well, at what velocity would we have to travel to escape the Earth's gravitational field? And what would happen once we left the Earth's atmosphere? And how would this ship be able to survive once it left that? And sometimes Poe is pretty close, and sometimes he's pretty far off, but he's working with the information he had. So throughout his life, he had this great interest in science. And this book, it's a Poe biography that tried to put in the context of science at his time, and what he knew about science, what were the great scientific developments, what were the things that Poe was reading, because he references these in his books. And sometimes the sciences, what we call pseudosciences now, there might be phrenology. Everybody was out there measuring the bumps on people's heads and thinking, oh, they got a big bump back here, that means they're angry, or they got a bump right here that's really big right there, maybe they're a good poet. And there's whole guides to heads. You can see some of these phrenological charts in your antique stores. Oh, there's Lily.
Oh,
So Poe was for a while interested in that, and then he turned his back on it and said, I don't really believe that's a great science anymore now. Not quite sure of it. So he kept evolving his scientific views, and one of his early poems is called Sonnet to Science. And he writes about how science is this condor that ruins his imagination. He wants to live in the woods with the nymphs and the naiads and everything. And here's science, crushes all that with dull realities flapping from out its condor wings. And so Poe had a love-hate relationship with science, because by the time of his last book, Eureka, he says it's all about science, and he interprets how the universe all fits together almost like a poem, because he was very interested in how a poem fits together, the rhythm, the rhyme, the meter, the imagery, the sounds, how it all should achieve a unified emotional effect on the reader. He said the Raven was designed so that every element of the poem led to the feeling of melancholy it was supposed to evoke, with the last lines, "And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating in the floor shall be lifted nevermore." He even said the O and nevermore was deliberately chosen because even if you didn't understand English, that sounded melancholy. The colors of the poems, everything. So the whole universe was designed like that in his vision, that it's just a poem. Because what could be better for a poet than to think that the universe is a poem? And then as for God, he tried to define what God could be. It was unparticled particles, that the whole universe was God. In fact, that we were God. And he got a little bit of trouble for saying that, all of us are God.
I bet.
Yeah, they said, oh, he's a pantheist or an atheist or a deist or something, but he's bad news. That was one of the great controversies during his time. In fact, that Marie Louise Schuh I told you about, she cut off things with Poe because of Eureka. Her pastor said, to save your soul, you have to cut off all contact with him immediately, because he's going to turn you into an atheist or something. So she did. So it's a good book. And the reason for the darkness of the night is basically Olber's paradox, which people are trying to find out, if there's an infinite number of stars out there, why is the sky dark at night if there's so many stars out there? That doesn't make any sense. So Poe's saying, well, maybe it does make sense. Maybe the stars are coming or at different distances from us, and some stars, the light hasn't even reached us yet. Other times the light might be reaching us now, but that star's not there anymore. And Poe's really envisioning this universe where everything's expanding. Some people believe the universe just sort of came out of sort of a cloud and things condensed for that. But his idea was just all sort of, well, there's Lily again, expanded outward from this single point, and it was continuing to expand. So it's a fun read, and we actually did a video interview with the author of that book. It's on the Poe Museum's YouTube channel. It's probably going to be a few years back, because I think we did that during the pandemic, during that whole dark era when everybody's under lockdown.
Yep. Oh, cool. I'll watch that. That sounds absolutely fascinating. And I know that we're getting ready to close the show and you can begin your Friday night, but what are you guys doing for Halloween month? What are you doing for October at the Poe Museum?
Oh, we have all sorts of fun on October 7th. That's the anniversary of Poe's death. So it's Poe's death day. Some people just have a birthday. We got a death day too. Sweet. And we're having Victoria Price, who's coming down to town. She's Vincent Price's daughter, and she's full of stories about her father and their family's relationship with Poe. She said growing up was almost like Poe was their fun uncle she'd never met because of how her father used to talk about him. So she's going to come to the museum, and then we're going to go to the old movie palace in town, the Bird Theater. It's a 1920s movie palace with the chandeliers and the organ that comes out of the stage and everything. And she's going to play Vincent Price's film The Raven, directed by Roger Corman. It also stars Peter Lorre and Boris Karloff, in addition to a young Jack Nicholson. So if you want to see what Jack Nicholson looked like in his 20s, he's in that movie. He's kind of got a part in there, and it's either the best Poe movie or the worst. It's great. It's about these rival wizards who are fighting over Lenore, and one wizard's abducted Lenore, so the other wizard wants to go fight him, and I think Peter Lorre is drunk through the whole thing, improvising his lines, which annoys Boris Karloff, who went through the trouble of memorizing his lines. Vincent Price is just playing along with it. Towards the end, I think Boris Karloff is having trouble walking and standing for a long time, so they decide the final battle of the wizards are sitting in thrones and like zapping each other from across the room, and it's just wonderful. It's just a full out comedy written by Richard Matheson, who realized their previous Poe movie they did was there's 3 short films put together in one. It was called Tales of Terror, and they realized the best part was the funny parts. They said, "Hey, let's make a Poe comedy." So this is a Poe comedy, and it's totally 1960s, totally goofy, off the wall stuff. So it's great, it's terrible, everything all at once. And then we have our Unhappy Hour. On the 4th Thursday of the month, we have the Unhappy Hour. It's a Halloween theme, costume contest, and all sorts of melancholy fun and games. And then throughout the rest of the month, pretty much every day, we're going to be having school groups over. We're going to terrify them, thrill them, chill them, then send them back to school with their teachers. And then I think it's the first Wednesday. Now, the second Wednesday, we're going to have Stephen Smith, who's coming here from London. He's got a show called The One Man Poe, where he does 4 different Poe stories. He's the only actor. He just completely changes his appearance. He'll run back behind the corner, completely changes his appearance, and run back out, do the next one. So for, say, the Raven, he gets a little old man makeup and a blue eye, and then he'll do the Pit and the Pendulum, and you never know who's going to pop around the corner next. So it's going to be a fun Poe-filled month. It's kind of like our Christmas.
I guess it sounds better than Christmas to me.
Yeah.
And I hate to say it, but I would be in heaven back there. And like I said this last time, I swear one of these days I'm going to come back there
Yeah.
and just experience everything and meet you in person and enjoy the month of Halloween, because it's such a magical time. And it sounds like you have so much going on.
During the Unhappy Hours, we also have live music playing. So I think we're having the embalmers out again. They dress up like old morticians, and they wear little fezzes on their hat, and usually have a dancing mummy. And then I do the curator's crypt. They set me up in a room where I just show some of the items from the collection, and people get up close to see what's the manuscript look like up close when you don't have to look through glass to see it, or what's Poe's ring look like, or I'll bring out some other stuff. Oh, this is what Poe's mother-in-law's socks look like, and you can smell them. They smell like nothing.
Oh, good. That's good.
Old linens and stuff, old textiles. You can smell them, and they have all these interesting smells. But it doesn't smell like anything.
That's good. That's comforting, actually.
Yeah.
I can.
Go, oh yeah, Poe's socks are going to stink after all these years. It's like, no, they don't smell like anything.
Good. What a blast. I mean, it's seriously, I just thank you for sharing all of that, the information about Poe and just some of your research and all the fun things going on at the Poe Museum. And if you've been painting, I've got to ask you this before I let you go. Have you done any painting lately?
Oh yeah, I have a show that just opened here in Richmond, and it's got about 20 new paintings in there. The most recent one I did for that was a bunch of black cats yawning, because I love the way cats yawn with that little tongue that curls out like that. And just imagine if I put my finger inside their mouth and I get it back out before they snap their mouth shut on you.
How fun.
But everybody sees me and think the cats are all like roaring or growling at you. No, they're all just yawning.
Oh, how fun.
And then I've got another commission coming up. So as soon as I finish the book I'm working on now, I've got to do another painting commission. Then I'll do some more fun paintings. And then we'll see where it goes from there. But you can't stop painting. You always got to keep creating. I'll keep imagining, because when you're not painting, you keep thinking about what you're going to paint next. You have to keep doing sketches so you'll be ready for the next one.
That is so cool. I'm glad that you're still at it, and you've got a lot on your plate, but it sounds like you're enjoying all of it. And I wish you the best of luck with all of your new projects and your show right now, and then having the best Halloween ever.
Well, thanks.
The museum. Yeah, thank you.
And Lily says hi.
Oh, what a sweet baby. Will you guys go have a fun night with your naughty cats?
All right. Have a melancholy evening.
Thank you. Take care. And everybody, you can go to chrissemtner.com, and then the Edgar Allan Poe, well, actually, the Poe Museum.org. So you can check out those two websites, and we'll post the links and show descriptions. But Chris, thank you so much for being a wonderful guest. And just you always, this is the second time you've been on the show. So I recommend everybody go back and listen to the first show that I did with you. But it's just been a wonderful evening, and I appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. And everybody out there, you guys have a wonderful weekend. I want to thank all of you guys for being in chat and for supporting the show. You can go to expandingfrontiersresearch.org to check out our work. You guys all have a wonderful weekend, and we will catch you next week. Thanks, Chris. Good night.
Thanks. And good night to Lily.
Good night, Lily.